Yeah, we've had a number of questions come through the chat. I'll just start in no particular order. I'll start with the first one. Was there any debate during the ratification of the Constitution for a guarantee of suffrage? Or what about during the drafting and ratification of the Bill of Rights?
Okay. At the convention itself, there was a great deal of discussion about who would get to vote. And in fact, I give a talk sometimes for Humanities Texas about the compromises at the Constitutional Convention. Some states wanted broad suffrage, okay? Other states wanted very narrow suffrage, high property qualifications. They could not agree. The first goal of the people at the Constitutional Convention was to come to an agreement on a new form of government. And so they had to compromise their competing interests to get some agreement. And where they compromised on the voting question was each state gets to decide. So if you as a state want to have broad voting rights, that's fine. If you as a state want to have some massive land ownership qualification, that's fine too. But that's what they could agree with. So there was discussion about that, but they chose to come to a compromise so that they could come together, coalesce, and agree on a constitution that they could then send to the states. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, during the amendment process and during the ratification process, there were anti-federalists. We call them anti-federalists because they opposed the Federalists, and the Federalists won, and winners write history, right? So the opposition to the Federalists are the anti-Federalists, the not Federalists. It's like the Dallas basketball team is the anti-Celtics because they lost to the Celtics on Monday night. They're going to lose to Phoenix tonight, but that's neither here nor there for our purposes, okay? Many of the anti-Federalists said that this is not a sufficiently democratic document because it doesn't guarantee the right to vote. But some anti-Federalists thought it was too democratic, that it gave too much authority to the people. And so there wasn't any kind of consensus on expanding the right to vote. It was basically just left to develop on its own and left to the states.
Excellent. And we have another great question. Were Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans subject to Jim Crow laws or other illegal ways to determine or stop them from voting as they did for Blacks in the South?
I'm less conversant with Native Americans and the law, other than Native Americans have been treated very poorly under the laws of the United States and constitutional interpretation generally. And one of the interesting things about the Supreme Court is that a justice who's usually labeled very conservative, Neil Gorsuch, the first Trump appointee, is from Colorado and is extraordinarily supportive of Native American rights. Was there discrimination in the franchise against Native Americans? I cannot imagine that did not occur. Hispanic Americans, Mexican Americans, Caribbean Americans, yeah, there was. And one of the things I'll talk about when we come around to talking about the Gwynn case is a case decided the same year as Brown v. Board of Education. Hernandez v. Texas is the first time the Supreme Court says you can't discriminate based on ethnicity under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. So in that sense, discrimination against on the basis of race and discrimination on the basis of ethnicity go hand in hand.
Great. Another question that came through, or can you give some examples of how we the people is still evolving today?
Oh, yes. One of the things that we're kicking around, and I don't know if you remember this, but there was an election in 2020 that was somewhat controversial. And part of the reason it was controversial is because states, because of a worldwide pandemic, softened their voting rules. So, for example, absentee voting, mail-in voting, collection of ballots, and the like rules changed because people were in danger if they congregated in mass numbers in polling places. Okay. Part of the argument there was that this would create enormous opportunity for fraud, and that in fact, states need to tighten voting regulations and restrictions. Yeah. And so, and Texas is one of the states that did, coming out of 2016 and also 2020, under the guise of protecting against fraud, because no one wants fraud in elections. So what you see with these laws is, to some degree, an effort to roll back the number of people who vote. Okay. With the argument being that only the people who should vote, who have the right to vote, can cast ballots. And so you've got, think about things like voter identification, rules that say you lose your registration if you don't vote in the last 3 elections or something like that. All of these are instances of trying to restrict the number of people who get to vote. And if you look at the people who are disproportionately affected by those sorts of rules, it's many of the people who have been enfranchised over time.
Great. So yeah, I think that kind of answers one of the questions about how state voter ID laws play a role in stifling the evolution of these people. So and another question that came through is, can the argument be made that it was originally the people who pay taxes have the proper right to vote?
Well, and realize that the federal income tax doesn't come into play until the early part of the 20th century. Until then, states had to pay, they were requisitioned a chunk of change for the value of the property in the states. And it was done, again, this is an Article 1, Section 2 thing, right? So the tying of the vote to paying taxes, at least at the national level, really never jumped up. That may have been an issue in some states. But I was going to look this up earlier today, but everyone here will know this. Sometimes students can be pesky, and they were pesky in this office today, which was great because they're actually interested in what we're doing. I'm teaching a course on the Roberts Court, which is, I've never done this before, and it's got a lot of interest. But I think the first state to give women the vote was Wyoming. And I could be completely wrong, but I know it was a Western state, and it was an effort to sort of create an incentive for women to move west as men were moving west. And so, states had the capacity to expand the suffrage. But that, again, wasn't a taxing concern. That was a men need companionship concern.
All right. We don't have any more current questions, so I think it's probably time anyway to move forward to look at the documents and the cases that you've provided.